one has to completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were. I mean, I did it, but I didn't foresee that, it just happened bit by bit, and you gradually, till this complete craziness is surrounding you, and you're doing exactly what you don't want to do with people you can't stand.
Would you take it all back, being a Beatle?
If I could be a fucking fisherman, I would.
By the time the middle of 1964 rolled around, the Beatles were on top of the world. Nothing could stop them. Nobody could tell them what to do. They were gods. The most beloved set of pop stars to ever have lived.
We came here at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 to see them, and all they do is push you farther and farther away, and then they don't even let you see them.
Despite standing before the eyes of millions, constantly performing, being filmed, photographed, and interviewed, they began to live unbelievably insulated lives. They were smuggled and shuttled from hotel rooms to venues and back. They lost all concept of money, not just because they were rich, but because every want, every need was procured and dealt with for them. The Beatles did not saunter around with a pocket full of cash. Everything was free, already paid for, or paid for as soon as they turned the corner. And it wasn't just commercial goods, but drugs and people in general, countless prostitutes or girls, hand-picked from whatever venue they were playing that night. Higher powers turned a blind eye or were paid off. The Beatles fixers themselves were happy, in fact, incredibly grateful to be ordered around to cater to their every demand, just so that they could swim in their wake, to experience this new world with them. But behind the scenes, things were far different. A slow but imminent collapse, one enabled by sycophants, huge egos, and immense financial blunders. The Beatles had no idea. For a long time, they were kept in the dark. Yes, they were incredibly rich, but they had no idea how much money they actually had, or how much money they could have been earning if things were different. They signed papers blindly. The marketing acumen of Brian Epstein had done wonders for the band, hidden his business ineptitude. But this facade was deteriorating. Brian struggled immensely with his mental health, with drug abuse. The curtain would finally fall on August 27th, 1967, the day in which Brian Epstein died of a drug overdose. Suddenly, the Beatles were on their own, and it was only then that they realized what a horrible mess they were in.
After Brian died, we collapsed. We broke up then. That was the disintegration.
This is part 2 of a multi-part series, a series devoted to one question. Why did the Beatles break up? I highly suggest you begin with part 1, which will provide an enormous amount of context and help you to begin to understand how these incredible friends, musicians, and cultural icons fell apart so contentiously. Welcome to part 2 of Why the Beatles Broke Up.
I've been on pills since I was 15, since I was 17. I was a pill addict until Help, just before Help, where we had turned onto pot and we dropped drink. Simple as that. I've always needed a drug to survive.
It would be impossible to tell any part of the Beatles' story without talking about their long and extensive history with drugs, mind-altering substances, amphetamines, pot, acid, heroin. Well, maybe not to the extent that a 1930s pop propaganda film would have you believe. Every single one of these affects your behavior, the way you operate, think, and feel. For the Beatles, this aspect of their story began in 1960. During their first appearance in Hamburg, they were required to play 6 or 7 hours a night, every night. And in order to accomplish such a feat, they turned to the assistance of little pills known as Purple Hearts. These gave them the endurance they needed and contributed to their manic and crazed behavior on stage, which the rough Hamburg audiences ate up.
The only way to survive in Hamburg, to play 8 hours a night, was to take pills like the waiters gave you.
This indulgence wasn't limited to just Hamburg, however. The Beatles' use of amphetamines would continue throughout their career, usually during their long, arduous recording sessions. They loved their pep pills, and it was these pills that John Lennon would introduce to the Boys' band manager, Brian Epstein.
I introduced him to pills, which gives me a guilt association for his death. I mean, they go that way anyway.
While the Beatles still used them very frequently, they almost became a tool rather than a pleasure. While the Beatles dove into pot and then acid, Brian began to use amphetamines daily, developing an addiction. And in order to sleep, he would follow them up with sleeping pills, barbiturates, downers. More on that later. It was Bob Dylan who had the pleasure of introducing pot to the Boys on August 28th of 1964. And Bob had no idea he was doing so, as he always thought that their #1 hit, I Want to Hold Your Hand, proudly declared, I get high, rather than I can't hide. In doing so, Bob Dylan created a cultural and musical butterfly effect like perhaps never before seen. The Boys adored pot, adored the way it made them laugh, spaced them out, and the way that it, unlike booze or amphetamines, didn't make them feel like shit when it wore off. It was a wonder drug, a revelation. Throughout the rest of 1964, the Beatles would conquer America and the world, flying all across the globe. More and more money poured in. They bought their parents' extravagant bungalows.
Mrs. Gravestock, does Ringo want to move house?
I don't really think so. He's asked us to have another house, but we're quite happy, and the neighbours and everybody's very good and proud that the Boys have got to where they are.
Themselves vast estates, and the kind of sports cars they only used to dream about. Even John Lennon, who didn't even know how to drive yet. There was not one person in the industry, or any industry really, who didn't want to get close to the Beatles. Everyone was chomping at the bit to join their inner circle. And there was one man who was very much not keen on this. Brian Epstein. Peers, musicians, celebrities? No problem. Underlings, like their beloved and loyal roadies, Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall? Indispensable. But anyone who could in any way shape the public's opinion of the Beatles or affect Brian's role and relationship in the management of the band was deemed a threat to be disposed of. Brian was fiercely possessive of the Beatles. Let's take a quick moment to say the following. Due to the nature of these videos, there will be a lot of focus on our characters' negative traits, their failings. This is not a video about the Beatles' rise, but their fall. No one is immune to these critiques, but please understand that I'm not going out of my way to assassinate anyone's character, and that the statements I make are not opinion or conjecture, but corroborated by numerous recollections from those directly involved in these relationships and situations. People are complex, and Brian was. Nat Weiss, who met Brian in 1964 and grew to be one of his closest friends, would recall of Brian, he wasn't a Jekyll and Hyde character. He was Jekyll and Hyde and about 20 other people besides. Brian wanted to control the Beatles. Not as some lord, not in some empirical sense, but because he wanted to be one of them. He discovered them, crafted them, and his jealousy when it came to the Boys was as much personal as it was business. And his continued use of drugs exacerbated this jealousy, this paranoia. But however high he was, he'd never talk about the Beatles. I've seen him at parties when people tried to broach the subject. Brian would suddenly change. It was as if an icy shutter had come down. To Brian, the relationship with the Beatles was something mystical. He himself used that word. He believed there was a chemistry between the five of them that no one else could understand. They weren't a business to Brian. They were a vocation, a mission in life. They were like a religion to him. When the Beatles first flew over to America for the Ed Sullivan Show, they were accompanied by Brian Somerville, who was currently serving as their press officer. After, depending on your source, he was quoted by name in an article about the Beatles, rather than remain anonymous, or after he had a number of arguments with John Lennon, he was berated and admonished by Brian to the extent that he promptly quit. And his replacement was to be a man named Derek Taylor, a journalist who had worked with Brian and the band previously, ghostwriting both a series of daily columns that were supposed to have been written by George Harrison, as well as Brian's autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise. Derek was a suave, intelligent, and well-spoken man. And despite him and Brian getting along brilliantly before he was appointed, things quickly fell apart. I'd been told he could be cruel. I only realized it when I came to organize a Fab Four press conference. Brian didn't want it to work. If I made a mess of it, even though the Beatles would be in that mess, he'd be happy, because I'd gain no control over them. Go ahead. But this is doomed. I look forward to speaking to you about it afterwards. I joined in April. Here he was in May, treating me with massive cruelty. After his appointment in April, Derek would quit at the end of the Beatles' summer tour in September of 1964. Derek's role may seem fairly inconsequential at this point, but he is a character who will return in our story, so his introduction is necessary. As 1965 arrived, Brian's drug use only increased. The management duties of his smaller acts fell completely to the wayside. He promoted assistant Peter Brown to help pick up the slack, but the Beatles obviously still took up the significant bulk of the company's attention. His behavior became erratic, and he developed a gambling problem. His personal assistant, Wendy Hansen, would frequently field calls from the Beatles themselves, who would be told that Brian was not in the office that day. The Beatles, meanwhile, were having a sunnier time. In February, they traveled down to the Bahamas to shoot for their next film, Help. This location chosen in large part due to tax concerns. They apparently spent the bulk of the shoot high off their asses on marijuana. After that, they would return home and conduct a good bulk of the rest of the filming at Twickenham Studios. And it was around this time that the Beatles, specifically John and George, along with their wives, Cynthia and Patty, first took a new kind of drug. A drug that made the pills and the pot look juvenile in comparison. A drug that would come to shape, in good and bad ways, the psyche of the band. LSD. It all began one night at a dinner party with the boys' quote-unquote dentist, who I'm sure never supplied them with any drugs of any kind and was just a tooth-cleaning acquaintance they happened to like. LSD is an incredibly powerful substance, one which, if taken in the wrong setting, could lead to a quote bad trip, or a step further, full-blown psychosis. So it was quite the experience when John and George were drugged involuntarily by their dentist, who may or may not have realized how strong the drug he slipped into their tea was. I'll let John tell the story.
A dentist in London laid it on George, me, and our wives without telling us at a dinner party at his house. He was a friend of George's and our dentist at the time. And he just put it in our coffee or something, you know. He was saying, I advise you not to. He didn't know what it was. There was just a sort of, you know, it's all the thing, you know, with the sort of the middle class London swingers or whatever. I hadn't all heard about it, and they didn't know it was different from pot or pills. And they gave us it, and he was saying, I advise you not to leave. And we thought he was all trying to keep us for an orgy in his house, and we didn't want to know, you know. No, I mean, this was at dinner, and we got out and went, and this guy came with us. He was nervous. He didn't know what we were going crackers, you know. I mean, it was insane going around London on it, and we thought when we went to the club, we thought it was on fire, and then we thought it was a premiere. Oh no, we thought it was a premiere. It was just an ordinary light outside. We thought, shit, what's going on here, you know? And we were cackling in the street, and then, you know, people were shouting, let's break a window. You know, we were just insane, you know? And then we went to the ad-lib and all that. And then some singer came up to me and said, can I sit next to you? And I was going, only if you don't talk. You know, like, because I just couldn't think. I was pretty stunned, you know, for a month or two.
There's no doubt about it. This drugging had a profound effect on the both of them. But was not the mind-warping, spiritually charged kind of trip they would later experience and seek out. It would be quite some time later before they took the drug again, specifically August 24th in Los Angeles, joined by members of the Byrds, as well as Peter Fonda, who over and over again repeated the following line, I know what it's like to be dead. Which, of course, would later inspire John's She Said, She Said. The whole story is a hoot, and incredibly fascinating, and I covered it in far more detail in one of my other videos. But with this trip, a trend developed. Ringo joined in this time, though it did not affect him as profoundly as it did John and George. Paul, meanwhile, did not join in. Paul, compared to the rest of the Beatles, was far more measured, far more cautious, and frankly, more comfortable in his own skin. What Paul prioritized was a certain degree of control of his thoughts and actions. He never suffered with substance abuse in the same manner that the other boys did, despite occasionally overindulging, especially with cocaine. There is a fantastic recollection from Richard Lester during their time filming Help in the Bahamas, which I think is very demonstrative of this mindset from Paul. Richard said, "I saw it happen to Paul McCartney once, the most beautiful girl I've ever seen, trying to persuade him to take heroin. It was an absolutely chilling exercise in controlled evil." Paul declined to take it. The Beatles were changing rapidly. Rubber Soul is usually tapped as the album that marked the Beatles' largest evolution as songwriters and musicians up until that point. Their days of teeny boppers were falling behind them. No longer must every song be written about love and cater to the fans. This evolution is often attributed to their drug use, specifically the pot. And this was certainly one aspect, but they were growing as people too, as musicians. And there is one other facet that is often overlooked: flexibility and control in the studio. You have to remember how quickly everything happened at this time. In 1963 and 64, the Beatles were touring to a near unprecedented degree. These years went by in a flash, and so did the recording sessions. They were still very much controlled by EMI and by George Martin. It was all very to the point. Studio time cost money, so no dilly-daddling. And as far as the Beatles were concerned, Martin and the engineers could handle the mix, and the Beatles could get back to their job, writing and performing. But in 1965, this began to change. They were still touring, but not to the same degree, and more so, due to the ungodly amount of money they were bringing in, they were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted in the studio. Gone were any restrictions. Nobody was saying, "Okay, you're booked for 6 hours today, let's get to work." No, the Beatles could use studio time however they wanted. They could rehearse for 8 hours straight on company time, if they pleased, and so they did. They began to slow down, to experiment, to see what sounds they could produce, not only in the recording space, but at the engineering console, turning knobs, seeing how the sounds changed. George Martin slowly became a collaborator instead of an overseer.
No, we just were getting better technically and musically, that's all. I mean, we finally took over the studio. I mean, in the early days, we had to take what we were given, and we had to make it in 2 hours or whatever it was. And 3 takes was enough, and we didn't know about you can get more bass and do it. We were learning the technique, and Rubber Soul, we were sort of more precise about making the album then, that's all. And we took over the cover and everything,
We now come to 1966. The Beatles received the longest break they ever had to that point, as January through March, they had no significant obligations. All the while, LSD's accessibility in the UK exploded. Paul had taken it for the first time near the end of 1965, though without the other Beatles, and at this time seemed uninterested in taking much more. Ringo dabbled, and George used the drug semi-frequently, continuing to explore the mind-opening possibilities of the drug. But John became something else entirely. He began using to such a degree that his personality as a whole began to shift. He became far more interested in religion, from Christianity to all realms of psychedelic spirituality, becoming obsessed with Leary's Tibetan Book of the Dead. This at first seemed to spur on his creativity more than ever, as well as soften his edges. He became less antagonistic, egotistic, and paranoid. But in many ways, it was like he was not there at all. He became incredibly isolated, and while Paul McCartney became the man about town, playing socialite and indulging in the blossoming avant-garde scene in London, John stayed holed up in his home. His wife Cynthia recalled, "When John was tripping, I felt as if I was living with a stranger. He would be distant, so spaced out that he couldn't talk to me coherently. John was taking LSD daily, and I became more and more worried. I couldn't reach him when he was tripping, but when the effects wore off, he would be normal again." Eventually, the Beatles had to get back to work. And what a piece of work it was. In April of 1966, the Beatles began recording what would become Revolver, a revolutionary piece of work, a bright, druggy album that reshaped the genre of rock and roll. It seemed to land in a sweet spot for all four Beatles. John's mindset was shifting and his breadth of creativity blossoming, but he was still very productive. Paul would produce some of the best songs he ever wrote. George was falling in love with India, but was still very involved with the band. Even Ringo joined in, as his drumming on Revolver is some of his best, only accentuated by the boys' new approach to mixing, with dry, punchy drums that gave the songs added force. And the album would kick off with a George Harrison song, one titled Taxman. Out of all the Beatles, no one was more attentive to their finances than George. He was very keen on making money. This was partially due to the fact that he was very aware that John and Paul were making a good bit more than him. But none of the Beatles were ignorant to the fact that they were all losing a significant chunk of their money to tax. As earners in the highest bracket, they were subject to the 95% super tax, along with, as George would comedically put it, surtax and tax. Now let's try to wrap our heads around this and provide a bit of context. The Beatles were filthy fucking rich. They were not losing 95% of their wealth to taxes. This 95% super tax only applied to income over a certain amount, something equating to around $5 million today. So rest easy. The Beatles were not going hungry, but they were spending extravagantly without accounting for the money they'd be giving up. But they were, in many ways, being let down by their team. Without getting into the morality of the matter, a significant part of the accountant's thoughts are consumed with one matter. How can we lose as little of our income to taxes as possible? Obviously, there are downright villainous aspects to this. Offshore accounts, fraudulent debts, and write-offs. But then there are the no-brainer, legitimate means to help lower your tax burden, such as investments, contributions, turning income into capital. All of these which the Beatles' accountants were desperately playing catch-up with. Coming from a family of retailers and businessmen, it's not as if Brian was some financial idiot. But at the same time, he was now dealing with an enterprise, magnitudes beyond anything he had ever dreamed of. The men who would take charge on this matter were accountants James Isherwood and Dr. Walter Strack. Isherwood suggested that they float their publisher, Northern Songs, on the stock market in February of 1965. The flotation meant John and Paul would not pay any tax on the proceeds when they sold their shares on the exchange. With that, the company was now public, meaning they all owned less of it. At the same time, John and Paul renewed their contracts, tying them to Northern Songs until 1973, while both George and Ringo signed on for another 3 years, their contracts ending in 1968. Meanwhile, Dr. Walter Strack was taking a much different approach. He had moved to the tax haven of the Bahamas, where he was to establish residence and set up a tax shelter for the band. This was the main reason why the Beatles shot parts of Help in the Bahamas, to say hello and show goodwill to Walter. Obviously, you're not going to find a lot of documented details on affairs such as this, but many years later, Ringo would very candidly recall, "We went into one mad scheme where we paid a guy to go and live in the Bahamas and hold our money for us so it would be tax-free. And in the end, we had to bring all the money back, pay the taxes on it, and pay this guy. So we might as well have just left it where it was." Put simply, it didn't work out. It was all a mess. A terrible mess. In late 1965, another accountant, Stephen Maltz, was brought in to help clean things up, to find virtually no record keeping on the group's earnings and expenses. By the time he put the pieces together, the picture was an ugly one. In April of 1966, a meeting was called with the band. Maltz would say, "Gentlemen, I've been studying your financial affairs, and the reality is that 2 of you are close to being bankrupt, and the other 2 could soon be as well. You have earned a lot, but you have also spent a lot, and no money's been put aside for taxes. You owe the taxman hundreds of thousands of pounds." And it was this meeting that directly inspired George's Taxman. The financial troubles would not end here.
We were just tired, you know. It had been, 4 years for us of legging around, you know, screaming in this mania.
It was once again time to return to touring, and this tour, unbeknownst to anyone, was to be their very last. Their tour began in Germany and included a return to their roots in Hamburg. Then they jetted to Tokyo, where the culture was unlike anything they had ever encountered, with probably the quietest and most well-behaved audience they had stood before in some time. Not to mention, the Japanese government as a whole was incredibly welcoming and served as gracious host. As they landed in the Philippines, the Beatles probably expected a similar experience. This was not to be the case. President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda had extended an invitation to the Beatles to attend a garden party at the presidential palace. The Beatles, very incorrectly, assumed this was not at all that big of a deal, or at the very least, did not care all that much if the president thought them rude.
It is indeed a great honour, but it's our day off, so we can't go.
What's he going to do? Arrest them? Well, not quite, but things got scary. News of the snub spread quickly through the newspaper, and a significant number of death threats were sent the Beatles' way. Brian scrambled to make amends, asking to appear on television to apologize, an appearance that was wiped out by a coincidental burst of heavy static. Any sort of police escort the Beatles typically received was now refused. As they quite literally ran to their airplane, they were jostled, punched, and kicked. It was a disaster.
We got there and we got put into the transit lounge. And then we got pushed around from one corner of the lounge to another, you know.
You treat like ordinary passenger. Ordinary passenger, you were saying. We're saying ordinary passenger, he doesn't get kicked, does he?
And so they started knocking over our road managers and things, and everyone was falling all over the place.
They started worrying you when the road manager got knocked over.
Yeah, and I swear there was 30 of them.
What do you say there were?
Well, I saw 5 in sort of outfits, you know, that were sort of doing it, the actual kicking and booing and shouting.
Did you get kicked?
No, I was very delicate and moved every time they touched me. But I was petrified. I could have been kicked and not known it. I just know I was
getting booed.
And then one of our guys, an announcement came over.
They're saying, will Mr. Epstein and Mr. Evans, will they get off the plane? And Mal, who was the nicest, gentlest person, was a big guy, but he was really sweet. He went past me on down the aisle of the plane to get off, and he was breaking out in tears, and he turned to me and he said, "Tell Lil I love her." That's his wife. Because he thought that was it, you know. I mean, the plane was going to go and he was going to be stuck in Manila. Anyway, we sat there again for, it seemed like a couple of hours. It was probably 30 minutes, maybe an hour. And they got back on the plane, and then the plane was allowed to leave. Apparently, they took the money off Brian Epstein that we'd earned at the concert.
Brian went into a panic and essentially shut down, breaking out into hives. Then things got even worse. Just weeks before they were scheduled to begin their US leg of the tour, an interview with John Lennon, conducted by journalist, friend to the Beatles, and potentially the woman behind Norwegian Wood, Maureen Cleave, was published in the US. And it was in this interview where John said the following: "The Beatles are more popular than Jesus." This statement did not even make a splash in the UK. But months later, when it reached the US, it caused an eruption, specifically in the deeply religious South, referred to as the Bible Belt.
The Beatles made a statement in all the newspapers that they're getting more better than Jesus himself, and the Ku Klux Klan, being a religious order, is going to come out here the night that they appear at the Coliseum here, and we're going to demonstrate with different ways and tactics to stop this performance. The Klan is going to come out here because we're the only organization that will come out and make a stop to these accusations. This is nothing but blasphemy.
Brian flew to the US ahead of the Beatles in an attempt to quell the outrage.
The quote which John Lennon made to a London columnist more than 3 months ago has been quoted and represented entirely out of context.
On his arrival, John publicly apologized, but the damage was done.
I just said, they are are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus. But I said it in that way, which is the wrong way. Yap, yap.
Well, some teenagers have said, have repeated your statements that the Beatles, I like the Beatles more than Jesus Christ. What do you think about that?
Well, originally I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Everywhere they went, the Beatles received death threats. A supposed American clairvoyant predicted they would die in a plane crash. Brian and the Beatles were physically and mentally sick. This was it, the Beatles told Brian. This is our last tour. The Beatles' final concert would be conducted at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, California. Brian was not there. Just before the concert, he had invited a former lover of his to the house where he and his associate Weiss were staying. When they arrived back, they found that their suitcases had been stolen. Brian's was full of drugs, pornography, and cash. He wasn't even that worried about the lost possessions, as much as he was about the potential of blackmail, which thankfully for Brian, never came. With that, the Beatles' touring days were over. In many ways, this was to be a godsend for the band, a chance, finally, to breathe. But for Brian, touring being his principal responsibility with the band, this felt like a death knell.
I'll hammer an imaginary nail in and give you an imaginary 5 shilling, and she agreed to that. She accepted that on the same basis as we accept her work. You know, I'd accepted her work, and that was how we met, actually.
When the Beatles quit touring in August of 1966, many wondered if this was it for the band. This only seemed more likely as the boys went their separate ways, with John flying to Spain to star as Private Gripweed in Richard Lester's How I Won the War. George and Patty would travel to India and spend over a month there. It was during this time that George's fascination with India evolved into something else entirely. He found himself suddenly disillusioned with the band, which seemed now so very small. Paul donned a disguise and, along with Mal Evans, drove through France before flying to the safari of Kenya. But Paul never quit thinking about the band or the next project. It was on his return that he dreamed up the concept for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Meanwhile, while Paul was away, John returned to London, and it was here, on November 7th, that he would meet another incredibly important character in our story, Yoko Ono. She was hosting an exhibition at the Indica Gallery, an exhibition that John fatefully decided to attend. Obviously, we have to spend some time here, not discussing their meeting itself, which has been well documented and mythologized, but the circumstances surrounding it. There are so many narratives surrounding this chance encounter, spanning from Yoko had no idea who John or the Beatles were, all the way to Yoko was stalking John. Throughout the years, Yoko has been subjected to an enormous amount of prejudice and contempt, painted as a witch, cited as the reason the Beatles broke up. Let's be frank, a lot of this vitriol is rooted in misogyny and racism. But at the same time, Yoko is incredibly far from some harmless angel. She's been manipulative, hypocritical, which, in her defense, are all character flaws that have been equally demonstrated by our beloved Beatles. Just as I stated, for Brian, there will be moments of negativity directed at Yoko. But I'm not here to paint anyone as a villain, because everyone, in some form or another, plays villain in this story. Let's begin with this. Yoko was, and is, an incredibly talented artist. Her work is often the subject of ridicule, the same ridicule that much of modern art is subjected to. But much of her work is fantastic, as well as her music. By the time Yoko met John, she was well established in the avant-garde scene. Not some huge celebrity, but known and respected. From what I can tell, the first person in the Beatles circle that Yoko met was Barry Miles, Paul's good friend and part owner of the Indica bookstore and gallery, along with Pete Asher and John Dunbar. Yoko becomes acquainted with them and the London art scene as a whole. At some point, she reaches out to Paul, asking if he has any song manuscripts to use as a part of some kind of a fundraiser for John Cage, a famed experimental composer she in the past had performed alongside, and one whose work Paul was a fan of.
Yoko turned up to see me first in London. She met me before she met John.
Yes, no, I didn't know that.
See, this is what I mean. And you won't hear it off them either. They want the story just how they put it out. She turned up for a charity thing. It was something to do. She wanted manuscripts, something to do with avant-garde music. Cage, John Cage, in New York. There was some benefit for somebody, and she was looking for manuscripts. Any spare lyric sheets you had around, and I was pretending to be on the backs of envelopes, quite funky little things. And to tell you the truth, I didn't want to give her any. Big deal. So, I'm allowed. I don't have to, do I? I didn't want to. I kept these manuscripts. They're very precious to me. So I said, but my mate might be interested. John, I gave her John's address, and I think that was first how they hooked up. And then she had her exhibition and stuff, and then their side of the story starts to happen then.
While Paul could very well be correct in that this was John and Yoko's first interaction, there is no record of her ever approaching John before their meeting at her gallery. Admittedly, they've been known to rewrite history, but considering how open John has been about most of the progression of their relationship, it would seem odd to choose to lie about this. Let's take a moment to hear John's side of the story. This excerpt is from his 1970 interview with Jan Winter, and is a piece of the interview I was unable to find a recording for. I went in. There was an apple on sale there for 200 quid. I thought it was fantastic. I got the humor in her work immediately. John Dunbar introduced us. Neither of us knew who the hell each other was. She didn't know who I was. She'd only heard of Ringo. I think it means apple in Japanese. And Dunbar had sort of been hustling her, saying, "That's a good patron. You must go and talk to him, or do something." Dunbar insisted she say hello to the millionaire. You know what I mean. And she came up and handed me a card that said breathe on it. One of her instructions. So I just went, this was our meeting. Here is the point of contention. She didn't know who John was. She didn't know who the other Beatles were, besides Ringo. This is something that a few people have cited as a big gotcha against Yoko, especially considering she contacted Paul previously. Let's read between the lines here a little bit. Yoko almost certainly knew who the quote-unquote Beatles were, no matter how submerged she was in her own bubble and the avant-garde. It's almost impossible that she had not been exposed to the band in some form. But at the very least, it's believable that she didn't know their faces or their names. When Yoko approached Paul about the manuscripts, it was likely because John Dunbar pointed her in that direction. Let's talk about that now. While Paul was not an owner of the Indica bookstore and gallery, he was a significant financial contributor. In fact, in this period, he would throw money at all sorts of artistic pursuits. So he had the reputation of being someone who was interested in the arts and had shitloads of money. So John Dunbar suggesting Yoko contact Paul was nothing crazy. When John came to visit Yoko's gallery, it seems that John Dunbar directed Yoko in a similar manner. John had a lot of money. Artists need money to fund their projects. Yoko probably knew who John was at this point, even if she didn't really know who he was, if that makes sense. And by playing coy with him, saying, "Oh, I don't know who you are. I don't know who the Beatles are," she was shrouding what her original intentions were. Get money from the rich man. We can dig into this more with a quote from John regarding their second meeting. "The second time I met her was at a gallery opening of the Klaus Aldenberg in London. We were very shy. We sort of nodded at each other. The next thing was, she came to me to get some backing, like all the bastard underground do, for a show she was going. After establishing a rapport with John, she did what came next. Ask for money. Was Yoko maneuvering? Attempting to gain something from John? Yes, without a doubt. Was this unusual for artists, whose work itself usually didn't bring in a whole lot of money? Not even in the slightest. It's simple pandering, and networking, connecting with more powerful, wealthy individuals to further your career. At this point, it's my belief that this was all Yoko wanted. We will continue to track their relationship, which really had a pretty slow build. The beginning of a whole new era for the Beatles. Finally, the overwhelming pressure of touring, press, everything that came with it, was finished. The Beatles could do whatever they wanted. They had the means, the time, to paint their lives into their ideal image. But John, lacking structure, went only deeper into his shell. Cynthia Lennon would recall, "I was optimistic too. The end of touring meant that John would be at home much more, and we could be together as a family. It would make a tremendous difference to Julian to have his dad around. I also hoped that, with fewer pressures, John might cut back on his drug taking. I longed to have the old John back, with the closeness we used to share. At this point, he had been at home with us for 9 months, and I was having to face the fact that things between us were no better. John was still taking drugs almost daily and was unconnected, distant, moody, and unpredictable. John was in another world. And he wasn't the only one. Quick trigger warning here. In late 1966, Brian Epstein attempted to commit by means of overdosing on sleeping pills. It was his secretary and chauffeur that had broken down the doors to his bedroom and driven him to the hospital. I'm not going to sit here and say that the whole of Brian's well-being hinged on his standing with the band. He had struggled with his mental health all of his life. But the ever-growing void between him and the Beatles undoubtedly had an effect. There was no longer any give and take, no relationship. The Beatles seemed to do whatever they pleased. But as we will see later on, Brian still played a role far more pivotal than he himself realized. There was one person that seemed to rejoice in his newly acquired time, who decided to squeeze every drop out of it he could. Paul. Paul loved work, and his work was music. Sgt. Pepper was dominated by Paul. He drove the vehicle, and everyone else was along for the ride. George contributed less on Pepper than on any other Beatle album.
It just seemed to me when we had a session booked, it was a cool idea to turn up. You know, but that wasn't always the case. Like Sgt. Pepper, George turned up for his number and a couple of other sessions, but not very much else.
John wrote some incredible music, but wasn't nearly as prolific as he had been. Which finally brings us to the following discussion. One terribly important to the rest of our story, and one that contentiously divides Beatles fans. Who was the band's leader, John or Paul? This question, to me, is almost hilarious, especially considering how heated the debate is. The answer is so incredibly simple, so easy to surmise. From 1967 on, John was still unquestionably the leader, but Paul led the band. What a bunch of contradictory nonsense, you might say. But let me explain. From day one, John was the leader. Paul and George looked up to John, and they continued to seek out his praise until the day they split. He was spiritually and energetically the band's leader. But Paul, even before Pepper, helped to lead John.
Well, only before, when the Beatles were against the world, did I have a cooperation of a good mind like Paul's.
Paul would frequently drive to John's home, wake him up from bed, write music with him. John hated work. He was lazy. Paul was a workaholic. There's a very good chance we have 2 or 3 less Beatles albums without Paul cracking the whip.
And, you know, we always thank Paul to this day. Because of Paul, who's the workaholic of our band, we made a lot more records than John and I would have made, say. You know, we'd like to sit round a little more. And then Paul would call, "All right, lads," and we'd go in.
It has been said over and over again by just about every single person in the Beatles circle that come 1967, John had become very different. He was still John, all right, biting, acerbic, talented as hell, but he was no longer as brash or as confident. In many ways, he became enfeebled, physically as well as mentally. There are a set of photos that have been reposted quite a bit online, comparing John in 1966 to 1967. This transformation that he undertook was significant. This was not the same John, and he agreed.
And I destroyed myself, I destroyed my ego, and I didn't believe I could do anything,
This had an effect on his music, or at the very least, his approach to music. Beatles engineer Geoff Emerick would say, by now, it was evident that John's personality was changing. Instead of being opinionated about everything, he was becoming complacent. In fact, he seemed quite content to have someone else do his thinking for him, even when we were working on one of his own songs. But this is not an indictment of his talent. He produced some of his very best work in this period: Strawberry Fields, A Day in the Life, I Am the Walrus. The fact of the matter is that Paul picked up slack wherever he saw it.
George and Ringo turned around and said, oh, look, piss off. We're fed up. Just back off. We're fine. We're grown-ups and we'll do it without you, fine. So I kind of go, oh, one of those people like me who don't realise when they're being overbearing. It can come as a great surprise to actually be told you are overbearing, So I completely clammed up and sort of backed off and sort of went, right, okay, I'm burned. Back off. They're right. I'm a turd. Sit here, fine. Okay, guys. So a day or so went by, 2 days, the session started to flag a bit. Ringo eventually turned and said, come on, produce, come on. And so it was like, you couldn't have it both ways, You either had to have me doing what I did, which, let's face it, I hadn't done too bad.
And as John grew increasingly insecure, he too found himself, or at the very least, allowed himself to be steamrolled by Paul, who himself wanted John to speak up more. The following excerpt is from the famous flowerpot conversation, recorded during the Let It Be sessions. Most of this snippet was not included in the Get Back docuseries. The audio is very rough, so apologies. The gist of this excerpt is Paul using a metaphor, kicking in the telephone box, to describe his frustration with John not speaking up for himself. This applies to much more than just music, but we'll get into that more on a later date.
We would actually all have done to see you get that telephone box in, because we want to see you do it. We actually want to watch the Steve McQueen film where he kicks the telephone box in, and we all want to see that. And I really think that
must be our own fault that we built it up that I can't kick the telephone box. Apart from it being my fault, you try and make George play competently because you're afraid that how he'll play won't be like you want him to play. And that's what we do, and that's what you do to me.
Yeah.
And that's the difference when you're saying that you're so annoyed at me being arrogant on the Beatles album. Was that I got to a bit where I thought, it's no good me telling them how to do it. All I tried to do on that album was just sing it to you like I was drunk, Just did my best to say, now look, it stands up on its own. If I'm not doing it quite well this time, I even Don't Let Me Down, the first time I sang it, because I hadn't allowed myself to say it was a whole song. I couldn't, it was only after we'd done it that I realised it was done. And on the Beatles album, I just sort of said, look, here it is, ignore here, this is me singing it drunk, pretend it is if I'm not. What would you do with it? George, you play whatever you like. And that's what it was. It wasn't the arrogance of, listen, this is it, baby. It was that, I can't tell you what to play, because you won't play like what I think you should play. And see, I'm not going to tell you what to play.
That seems to be the trouble, is that, okay, that's great, isn't it? And then, if you've been able to say that on the occasion, just even to say, look, I'm not going to say anything about the song because it's really difficult. I'm going to really try now to sing it to you.
Because you would say, listen, you haven't arranged it.
I know.
I'd say, listen,
I say that, of course, when you say that to me, because I haven't picked it up off you.
But the point is,
sort of, I think...
I'm saying that Dear Prudence is arranged. Can't you hear boom, boom, boom? That is the arrangement, But I'm too frightened to say, this is it, but I'll just sit there and say, if you don't come along and play a bit, I won't do the song, you know, I can't do any better than that. But don't ask me for what boogie you're going to play on it. Because apart from not knowing, I can't tell you better than you what boogie to play on it. You know, I just can't work, I can't do it like that. I never could, you know. Now when you think of the other albums, just think, how much more have I done towards a number than that? I've never told you what to sing or what to play. You know, I've always done the numbers like that. Now, the only regret, just the past numbers, is when, because I've been so frightened, I've allowed you to take it somewhere where I didn't want.
The musical and interpersonal balance between John and Paul is what made the Beatles tick, which is why as these relationships degraded more and more, so did the band. It could never just be John. Nothing would get done, or would be done haphazardly. It could never just be Paul, demonstrated by the dynamics in the band as he took more and more charge. That's what bothers me so much about this debate. Nothing in this world is black and white. To try and attribute the band's success to one person or another is ridiculous. John and Paul had extremely different strengths and weaknesses. They came together to form a whole. There is no reason to disparage one in order to prop the other up. And trust me, there is plenty disparagement enough coming up for both of them, but not to create an agenda or a narrative, but as a means to understanding the whole truth. As John's confidence faltered, Paul's grew.
And I feel weak. I think he must feel strong, you know.
Here's a point I think needs hammering down. When it came to collaborating on other songs, Paul was a willing and engaged participant and was never horrifically overbearing. But when Paul brought a song of his own to the table, he played the director. Unlike John, who was very flexible, if sometimes insecure, about where a song of his was headed, Paul came into the studio with just about the entire song in his head. He knew what he wanted it to sound like, which naturally, at its best, led to less collaboration, and at its worst, became him just telling the others what to do. Again, it's hard to argue with the music, but as far as the dynamics of the band were concerned, it led to the others feeling sidelined. And while the Beatles continued to produce all-time great music, Brian Epstein did what he could to pick himself up following his last attempt on his life. He, just like the Beatles, could do just about anything he pleased. But what did he want to do? For a while, he poured much of his attention into the Saville Theatre, which he had purchased in 1965. He helped fund a number of productions there, very few which broke even. When an old teacher of his fell ill while directing a play, Brian Epstein himself stepped in to direct. And according to his assistant at the time, Joanne, Brian took over and really threw himself into rehearsals. He was totally involved, right up to the evening of the dress rehearsal. All the cast were waiting in their costumes, but no Brian. He'd forgotten all about it. He became more and more avoidant of his business affairs. He would frequently cancel appointments. He was embroiled in a lawsuit involving Seltape, the company behind the Beatles merchandising fiasco I recapped in part 1, and he failed to attend the pre-trial examinations. Brian began to look for someone to help, and someone to eventually take over NME entirely. And he, in his mind at least, found the candidate he was looking for, Robert Stigwood. Stigwood was a fellow rock manager, representing acts such as Cream. He was also a complete stranger to the Beatles. Derek Taylor would recall, there was no doubt that many people, particularly John, were suspicious when, early in January 1967, NIMS and Robert Stigwood's management amalgamated. Stigwood was made a joint managing director of NIMS with Brian. However, without actually lying, Brian managed to somehow convince the Beatles that this was a boardroom arrangement, and Stigwood had no power. But it was more than even that. Peter Brown would say, Brian made the following offer to Stigwood and Shaw. He would sell them 51% of NIMS, a controlling interest, in a reverse takeover to avoid sustaining a large capital gain. Brian would remain chairman of the board and would continue to look after Cilla and the Beatles exclusively. Stigwood and Shaw could have all the rest. The price was an astonishingly paltry £500,000, considering that Brian had been offered $20 million only 2 years before. The written deadline for Stigwood and Shaw to raise the money was in May of 1967, but when that date passed, Brian made a verbal agreement with them to wait until September. But in his heart, Brian was scared. First of all, he had not told the boys about his plan to sell the controlling share of NIMS to Robert Stigwood. Secondly, he was worried by what he saw as signs of the Beatles' growing discontent. They were slowly hearing bits and pieces of the cell tape fiasco, and they were beginning to learn that Brian was unable to get out of bed until 5 o'clock in the afternoon because of the huge amounts of barbiturates in his system. He was scared most, however, because unknown to almost everyone, the Beatles' management contracts with Brian were up in the fall of 1967. There was very little doubt about it. Brian was on the verge of collapse. He was willing to give away his business, everything that he had built up, for pennies. He would continue to look after his favorites, but what would that even really mean when he didn't have control of the company? What would the Beatles think? Just as before, they were in the dark. And to make matters even more complicated, it was not long after this initial merger with Stigwood that Brian negotiated the Beatles' next recording contract with EMI, a contract that would create immense trouble for the boys, as well as costing them a significant amount of money. First off, the level of royalties distributed to the band were certainly not generous, especially considering their popularity and the amount of money they were bringing in. Secondly, Brian had written into the contract that his company NIMS would receive 25% of those royalties, even if they decided not to renew their contract with Brian in the fall. And finally, to cap it all off, everything written here would apply for a whopping 9 years. And the Beatles signed it all. They naively put complete trust in Brian and his team, a team that had made no effort to point out these stipulations in the contract or the implications they had. Brian wasn't perfect, but he had done so much for them. And personally, he cared for them. Surely, Brian wouldn't screw them over. There was no need to pore over the fine details, to read in between the lines. On Tuesday, March 21st, John Lennon inadvertently took acid while in the recording studio. George Martin would recognize that something was wrong with John, but simply thinking him ill, he suggested they step out onto the roof for fresh air, where John, high out of his mind, gazed at the stars before the other Beatles got wind, and fearing John would believe he could fly, ran up as quickly as they could. While this story is a lot of fun, it is actually what happened afterward that we will spend time on. It was following this debacle that Paul decided, shockingly, for the very first time, to take LSD alongside John. Despite how close the two were, Paul had never wanted to engage or participate in John's frequent acid benders. At this point, John had taken the drug hundreds of times, while Paul, as far as I can tell, had taken it just a few times. LSD is an incredibly powerful drug, one which will elevate every thought you have. I think it's important to share Paul's recollection of this night, not to read into and psychoanalyze every statement, but just like everything else I've presented to you, as a means of furthering your understanding of these two individuals' relationship. Maybe this is the moment where I should take a trip with him. It's been coming for a long time. John's on it already, so I'll sort of catch up. Me and John, we'd known each other for a long time. Along with George and Ringo, we were best mates, and we used to look into each other's eyes. The eye contact thing we used to do, which is fairly mind-boggling. You dissolve into each other. But that's what we did, round about that time. That's what we did a lot, and it was amazing. You're looking into each other's eyes, and you would want to look away, but you wouldn't, and you could see yourself in the other person. It was a very freaky experience, and I was totally blown away. There's something disturbing about it. You ask yourself, how do you come back from it? How do you then lead a normal life after that? And the answer is, you don't. On May 15th, Paul McCartney attended a performance by Georgie Fame at the Bag o' Nails Club. It was here where he would meet a woman, Linda Eastman. Now, Paul obviously was still with Jane Asher, which those of you in the know realize meant very little to Paul. As far as physical commitment went, Paul and Linda would leave the club together. Both denied that anything but flirtation occurred that night. 4 days later, Brian Epstein would host an extravagant press release party for Sgt. Pepper's. Linda, as a photographer, was extended an invitation very soon beforehand, which probably had nothing to do with Paul having recently met her. Wink wink. The two are photographed, looking very cozy together. It was also around this time that a certain man began to grow very close to the band, and primarily John Lennon. His name was Yannis Alexis Mardes, better known as Magic Alex. You aren't going to find much more of a character than Magic Alex. He was apparently a technological wonderkind who, as a teenager, was sent to a special academy to pursue his prodigious talents. Well, that didn't amount to much, and he was working as a television repairman when he met John Dunbar of Indica Bookstore and Gallery, the very same man who introduced Yoko to the Beatles circle. Alex was creative and had some level of technological ability, but far more than that. His most spectacular talent was that of persuasion, manipulation, and weaseling. Somehow, this television repairman managed to ingratiate himself with all sorts of prominent figures in London, such as Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. John became enamored with an invention of Alex's, hilariously called the Nothing Box, which was nothing more than a plastic box with randomly blinking lights. Dunbar would recall of Alex, he was quite cunning in the way he pitched his thing. He knew enough to know how to wind people up, and to what extent. John had always been very impressionable, especially from so-called outsiders or alternative visionaries. And this aspect of himself had only grown more prominent with his continued use of LSD. John had built up a thick wall, but when that wall was penetrated by someone, it fell away completely, and he trusted them wholly. It was actually John who gave him the nickname Magic Alex. Alex pitched John on a number of insane inventions he was supposedly working on, such as a force field that would surround the Beatles' homes, invisibility paint, and wallpaper speakers. It kind of speaks to how addled everyone's brains were on LSD at this time that anyone believed a lick of this. Even skeptical Paul bought into the nonsense, though not nearly to the extent of John. But at this point in time, no one seemed in their head. Paul had just recently conceived the Magical Mystery Tour, which was to be a piece of experimental, guerrilla-style filmmaking, written and directed by the Beatles themselves. While it was Paul's project, the other Beatles bought into it more than they would later claim. But even more insanely, John had grown enamored with the idea of the Beatles purchasing their own island, creating a compound there, a commune, a utopian paradise. And this wasn't just a flippant proposal, it was serious. Derek Taylor would write, "We were all going to live together now, in a huge estate. The four Beatles and Brian would have their network at the center of the compound, a dome of glass and iron tracery, above the mutual creative play area, from which arbors and avenues would lead off, like spokes from a wheel, to the four vast and incredibly beautiful separate living units." Magic Alex saw his opportunity to ingratiate himself even further with the band. Alex was from Greece and just so happened to have some very powerful connections with the military regime that had recently taken over. He was sent to help find a suitable island for the Beatles. There were other motives in play here beyond some utopian dream. The Beatles wanted to take up residence someplace where their tax burden would be lessened. They also wanted the ability to attain and consume as many drugs as humanly possible without repercussions, which it seemed, with Magic Alex's influence, plus a good lump of cash, the fascist Greek government was perfectly content with allowing. But hey, you might say, the Beatles were always pretty liberal. They spoke up for equality, for peace. Why would they want to associate themselves in any way with a dictatorship that tortured and executed its political opponents? Well, I'll let John himself tell you. I'm not worried about the political situation in Greece as long as it doesn't affect us. I don't care if the government is all fascist or communist. I don't care. They're all as bad here. Worse, most of them. I've seen England and the USA, and I don't care for either of their governments. They're all the same. Which is not a great angle to take when you have just recently started speaking out politically. Alex found them an island, so the Beatles seriously flew to Greece and for the next week tripped on acid and vacationed along the coastline, visiting the island itself, deserted but for a couple of fishing shacks. When the island was not the sandy oasis they had hoped for, but a pebbly, boulder-filled chunk of land, Alex basically said, "Oh, no worries, mates. I'll have the government come with helicopters and take the rocks away." At some point during all of this, the acid-washed delusion faded away, but this pattern of thinking did not. The Beatles had big ideas, and they also had accountants urging them to start investing their money in businesses. This was not a good combination. They were open for anything. On August 1st, George Harrison and his wife Patty would fly to Los Angeles, where he was to see his mentor, sitarist Ravi Shankar. And it was here in Los Angeles where Patty would happen to read about a guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a teacher of transcendental meditation who just so happened to be hosting a lecture at the Hilton Hotel in London on the 24th of August. She and George were instantly intrigued. Along with Paul, John, and their partners, they would all attend the lecture, where they all, to varying degrees, were enamored with the yogi, who spoke of true spiritual bliss. Bliss which could not be attained through drugs, but through meditation. Was this finally the answer? George and John certainly thought so, and Paul and Ringo figured they'd join along for the ride, because why not? Let's see what it's all about. Maharishi was conducting a 10-day-long meditation clinic in Bangor, Wales, just days later. Maharishi recognized the marketing potential of the Beatles' involvement, and they were given star treatment and unending attention from the yogi. They had gotten on the fast track to spiritual bliss. The day after their arrival, on the 26th of August, the Beatles declared publicly that they were through with LSD and drugs in general. It was a new beginning for them, and hopefully for the generation as a whole. Then, the very next day, Brian Epstein would die of a drug overdose. With that, we come to the end of part 2. Thank you all so much for watching. If you would like to continue the story, please consider subscribing. I'll be releasing these videos every 2 weeks. I also have a large number of videos recounting the Beatles' history and the making of their albums, if you want to see more. And if you'd like to watch part 3 of the series right now, you can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. It's a wonderful way to support the channel, and I would like to take a moment to personally thank all of my Patreon supporters. With that, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.